Welcome, good to see you all. And we are at Thurber House. I am Paul Hammock, Thurber House in Columbus, Ohio. James Thurber lived here, lived in a lot of houses in Columbus, Ohio. And we're in the house that he lived in when he went to Ohio State University from about 1913 to about 1917. James Thurber is one of the great American authors and is often compared with Mark Twain. He was a humorist. He never wrote any novels, but he was a master of the short form, is what they like to say. He also is very well known for his cartooning, especially his cartoons of dogs. And his career at the New Yorker, he blossomed into being one of America's great writers. I like to move throughout the house and tell the stories about the family as we see the house. And this room has a great history too, because we know that the father of 3 boys had a lot of noise to put up with. The Thurbers had over 50 dogs, and not all at one time, I might add. One poor boy almost fainted when he thought that was true. But they always had 2 or 3 dogs. And this is where Charles would retire, close off the doors, and put himself in isolation. And the boys and the dogs knew this was kind of his area. Let me read you a great quote about Charles. He was a politician and not a striking man, never accomplished great things. But Thurber himself, in a great book called The Thurber Album, writes a chapter about some people that had a big impact on his life. And this is not a long quote, but it certainly tells you about Charles Thurber. He was always mightily plagued by the mechanical, Thurber writes. He was also plagued by the manufactured, which takes in a great deal more ground. Knobs froze at his touch, doors stuck, lines fouled, the detachable would not detach, the adjustable would not adjust. He could rarely get the top off anything and was forever trying to unlock something with the key to something else. So Charles was quite a man, and of course he had then to put up with his wife, Mame. And she is quite a story in herself. She was a Fisher, and the Fishers are a very famous family in Columbus. There were 5 Fishers, and Mame is really the one that we think Jamie got a lot of his humor from. And a few stories will suffice for you to understand how that works. We're not going to go in the kitchen, which is now our office, but in the kitchen, Mom used to bake brownies every Christmas. And this is an interesting thing she did nearly every year, and James remembers, because they had a dog, Muggs, who liked to bite people. And she had a very cavalier attitude toward this dog's biting people. She just made sure she knew who they were so the boys could give them chocolates and brownies every Christmas for being bit by Muggs. And that's kind of the way she took things. Another funny dog story that has to do with Mame that I always enjoy is she had a sister who didn't like dogs. And according to Thurber, the dogs didn't like her either. But she was coming over once and they had a great plan. And Mame said to the boys, go get some dogs in the neighborhood and go gather them up. They had 2 or 3 at the time of their own, but they had over 12.5 dogs, according to Thurber, locked in the basement. The sister came. Mame says, oh dear, I'm so busy with dinner. Would you feed the dogs? Oh, I hate those dogs. Just set the plate by the top of the stairs, open the door, and they'll eat, no problem. Well, you can imagine. And Thurber writes about the incident with wonderful humor. The dogs burst out, nearly knocking her down. She grabbed a broom, chased them, ran them all over the house. They were jumping out of windows. She had to chase them out from under the beds. And it was quite chaotic, like so many things in the Thurber house. And at the very end, Charles looked at his wife, and this is how Thurber writes the end of this little incident. Well, I hope you're satisfied, Charles says. And James writes, she was. Now we'll move upstairs, and oh my heavens, I can't help but remember one more Mame story because it happened at a banister just like this. Charles was a politician, and imagine him sitting in the parlor with all the politicians in a very serious way, talking about whatever politicians talked about in Columbus. And Mame, in a negligee, which would have been a little risque at the time, is said to have draped herself over this banister and in a very loud voice proclaimed to all of these gentlemen, at last they've let me out of the attic. That was Mame Fisher, and poor Charles lived with her happily all these years. His life and adventures were all in Columbus, like a typical childhood, though one incident stands out, and it was when they were living for a short time or visiting in Washington. His brother William wanted to play William Tell. And being the younger brother, Jamie got to play the one with the apple. Now, to his wisdom, he did have his back to his brother, but unfortunately was impatient, and he turned at the wrong time and had his eye put out as about 7 years old. So James Thurber had a glass eye all of his life. Because of that glass eye, his other eye went bad, and the last 4 or 5 years of his life, he was pretty much legally blind, could see very, very little. But it didn't keep him from working. I mentioned one of the pieces we have here, the glasses he used, and there's a picture of him that you may not be able to see too well, working very, very close to his drawings that helped him to see even as his blindness came upon him. But his life at Ohio State was interesting because of that glass eye. He couldn't pass biology, he had trouble with ROTC, which was required, and he was no good at baseball. He had no depth perception. So poor Mr. Thurber did not graduate from Ohio State. Now, I mentioned the New Yorker, and this is really where Thurber's life took off. When he was in Connecticut, he lived in Connecticut most of the time. He worked for Ross. Ross was the editor of the New Yorker, and their relationship and his relationship with E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Web, really, really solidified him as a writer in the American's eye. Most of his short pieces were published originally in the New Yorker, and his cartoons got rave reviews. People really loved him. As primitive as they are, they captured something. And a fun story that we tell in a short video that I like to tell is how a real cartoonist came into Ross and was irritated. He said, "How can you turn down my work and print this fifth-rate artist's cartoon?" No, Ross interrupted. "Third-rate artist," he said. So they had quite a fun working relationship. It inspired Thurber even to write a book called My Years with Ross. He wrote a play called The Male Animal, which was made into a movie. Henry Fonda and Olivia de Havilland, a wonderful movie, but if you're a real strong Buckeye fan, we in Columbus, Ohio, many of us are Buckeyes, he isn't real fond of the football program at Ohio State, and he takes some shots at it, though very indirectly, because he never refers to the university by name. But it's quite a fun film. Walter Mitty, played by Danny Kaye, is pictured here. That's another thing people often associate with Thurber. It's one of his better known pieces because it was put into a movie. And he's a daydreamer. His wife constantly heckling him, but Walter Mitty would daydream that he was saving the world yet again. And this then is Jamie's room. James Thurber stayed in this room the years he worked, and this is one piece that we know did belong to him. When he was a young reporter at the Columbus Dispatch, and he has a collection of My Life in Hard Times, and he writes about incidents that happened to him in Columbus. One of the hilarious stories is the day the dam broke. And there was a flood here in 1913, in fact, and it was a very serious flood that took a lot of life and really caused a lot of problems. But Thurber always took the humorous side, and that's one of his very, very humorous tales. It talks about the panic of people 3, 4, and 5 miles away from the flood, running madly down the street, screaming, "We're gonna die. Go east, young man, go east." But Thurber had many of those experiences and wrote for the Dispatch on that typewriter. James Thurber, he's one of our great, local boys that made good. So that pride really brought people to wanting to restore this house and having it open. Not only is it now open for touring, just to talk about Thurber, we have a writing academy in which children can sign up for Saturday mornings. We have camp programs. We bring in authors, adults. We have adult writing classes. So Thurber, as a writer, has really given Thurber House a chance to make Columbus a center for great writing and remembering great writers like James Thurber.